come back for me?
Always, sweetheart. I promise.
The bullet screamed past his ear so close he could smell the gunpowder burn his hair. Christopher Kit Carson didn't flinch. At 25, standing barely 5'2" in his worn moccasins, he'd learned that survival in the Rocky Mountains wasn't about size, it was about nerve. And right now, nerve was all that stood between him and the massive French trapper who wanted him dead. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began, that sweltering July morning in 1835, when 1,000 souls gathered in the Green River Valley for the wildest celebration the American West had ever seen. Inspired by true events, the rendezvous was like nothing civilization could imagine. Picture this: a sprawling encampment where beaver trappers who'd spent a year alone in the wilderness came to trade drink and raise hell. White men speaking French and English mingled with Shoshone, Arapaho, and Flathead warriors. The air hung thick with wood smoke roasting buffalo meat and that peculiar scent of thousands of animal pelts stacked high as a man's head. Kit Carson arrived on a tired sorrel mare, leading 2 pack horses loaded with beaver pelts, a whole year's work reduced to bundles of fur. He was quiet by nature, the kind of man who spoke only when he had something worth saying. His clothes were simple buckskin shirt, canvas pants, patched at the knees, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. Carson, a burly trader named Mackenzie, waved him over to the American Fur Company tent. "What you got for us?" Kit dismounted silently and began unloading his pelts. Mackenzie examined them with practiced hands, holding them up to the light, testing the softness. "Good work," Mackenzie grunted. "Best tanning I've seen this season." "Where'd you learn that?" Kit just shrugged. He hadn't learned it, not yet anyway. These were his rougher pelts, the ones he'd processed himself, with mediocre results. But he knew better than to admit it. The mountain men lived by a simple code: never show weakness. The trading took hours. By the end, Kit had exchanged his year's labor for gunpowder-lead coffee sugar, new beaver traps, and a little cash. It wasn't much. These merchants charged outrageous prices for goods they'd hauled from St. Louis, but it was enough to survive another year in the mountains. As the afternoon sun beat down, Kit wandered through the encampment, taking it all in. Men wrestled in the dirt for sport. A group of trappers had organized a shooting contest, betting horses and rifles on who could hit a target at 200 yards. Somewhere in the distance, fiddle music competed with the rhythmic pounding of tribal drums. That's when he saw her. She sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, working on a buffalo hide stretched across a wooden frame. Her hands moved with surgical precision, scraping away fat and tissue with a bone tool. Even from a distance, Kit could tell she wasn't just good at this, she was an artist. The woman was Arapaho, probably in her early 20s. Her buckskin dress was adorned with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to complete. 2 long braids framed a face that made grown men stumble over their own feet as they passed. But it wasn't just her beauty that caught Kit's attention. It was the focused intensity in her eyes, the pride in her work. "That's," Aiyana said, a voice beside him. Kit turned to find old Bill Williams, a grizzled trapper who knew every tribe from the Missouri to the Pacific. "Aiyana," Kit repeated softly, tasting the word. "What's it mean?" "Eternal blossom or something like that," Bill said. "Daughter of Chief Broken Lance. Best tanner in the whole damn territory. You see how soft that hide is? That's brain tanning, son. Ancient art. She can take the roughest buffalo hide and turn it into something soft as velvet. Waterproof, too." He spat tobacco juice. Every trapper here would give his left arm to have her process his pelts. Kit watched as Aiyana worked. She seemed oblivious to the dozens of men stealing glances at her. Every few minutes, someone would approach, usually a young warrior from one of the tribes, but she'd dismiss them with a polite smile and return to her work. "She's particular," Bill continued, reading Kit's thoughts. "Turned down more men than a saloon girl on Sunday. Her daddy's chief, so she can afford to be choosy. As if on cue, a commotion erupted near the center of camp. A massive figure on horseback came thundering through the crowd, scattering people and dogs. The rider was easily 6'4", 250 pounds of muscle and bad attitude. His buckskins were decorated with wolf tails, and he carried a rifle across his saddle that looked more like a cannon. "Jacques Le Grand Bill," muttered. "French-Canadian trapper. Mean as a rattlesnake, and twice as ugly." Jacques was clearly drunk. He wheeled his horse around, shouting in French-accented English, "I am Jacques Le Grand, the greatest trapper in these mountains. Any American dog who says different can face me like a man." Some men laughed. Others just moved out of his way. Jacques had a reputation for brutality. Kit had heard stories how Jacques had once beaten 3 men senseless in a fight over a card game, how he'd left a rival trapper tied to a tree for wolves to find. Jacques spotted Aiyana and his drunken face split into a leer. He rode straight toward her, his horse's hooves churning up dust. Aiyana stood, her face carefully neutral, but Kit saw the flash of fear in her eyes. "You," Jacques boomed, pointing at her. "You will be my woman? I will give your father 10 horses 20. He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "These weak Americans cannot handle a wildcat like you. You need a real man, a Frenchman." The men nearby shifted uncomfortably. In the complex social web of the rendezvous, this was a delicate situation. Aiyana was the daughter of an important chief. Insulting her could spark violence between the trappers and the Arapaho. But it was more than politics that made Kit's jaw tighten. It was the casual cruelty, the assumption that Aiyana was property to be claimed. It reminded him of everything he hated about bullies. Before he knew what he was doing, Kit stepped forward. "You should apologize to the lady," he said quietly. The camp fell silent. Jacques turned his horse to face this new challenger, squinting down at the small figure blocking his path. When he realized who it was, he burst out laughing. "Look at this." A mouse challenges a bear. Jacques' face darkened. "You are the American dog Carson. Yes, I have heard of you. They say you can shoot. But can you die well?" Kit felt every eye in the rendezvous upon him. His heart hammered, but his hands remained steady. "Get off your horse," he said, "and we'll settle this proper." What happened next would be retold around campfires for decades. The rules were simple and brutal. Each man would mount his horse at opposite ends of a 50-yard clearing. At the signal, they would ride full speed toward each other and fire. 1 shot each. If both survived, they could reload and do it again, but in practice, the first shot usually settled everything. Jacques chose his heavy Kentucky rifle, a weapon accurate at 300 yards. Kit pulled out his pistol, a short-barreled, 50 caliber percussion cap revolver that he wore tucked in his belt. The crowd murmured. A pistol against a rifle at charging distance, the kid was committing suicide. "You sure about this, Kit?" Bill Williams asked quietly. "That Frenchman's killed men before." "I'm sure," Kit said. His voice was calm, but inside his mind raced through calculations. Jacques was drunk. His massive rifle would be harder to aim from horseback. And most importantly, the bigger man would expect Kit to panic. Kit wouldn't panic. He never did. They mounted up. Aiyana stood at the edge of the crowd, her face unreadable. Kit caught her eye for just a moment. He wanted to tell her he was doing this for the right reasons, not to win her like some prize, but because somebody had to stand up to men like Jacques. But there was no time for words. "Allez!" someone shouted. Both horses exploded forward. The crowd roared. Kit leaned low over his mare's neck, the pistol heavy in his right hand. Across the clearing, Jacques sat tall, aiming his long rifle. Time seemed to slow. Kit could see Jacques' finger tightening on the trigger. He could see the black eye of the rifle's muzzle pointing straight at his chest. Then, everything happened at once. Jacques fired. The rifle's boom echoed off the valley walls. Kit felt the bullet pass so close to his head that it singed his hair, the powder burns, leaving a smoking patch above his left ear. The pain was instant and searing, but Kit didn't flinch, because he'd already pulled his trigger. His bullet caught Jacques' right hand just as the big man's finger was moving for a second shot, if he'd had one chambered. The .50 caliber ball shattered Jacques' thumb and wrist, destroying his gun hand in an explosion of blood and bone. Jacques screamed and tumbled from his horse, landing hard in the dust. His rifle went flying. The crowd erupted in shocked amazement. Kit reined in his mare and dismounted, pulling his second pistol. Mountain men always carried two. He walked calmly toward Jacques, who was writhing on the ground, clutching his ruined hand. "Don't kill me," Jacques shrieked in French and English. "Don't kill me. I surrender mercy." Kit stood over him, the pistol pointed at Jacques' head. The clearing fell silent. Everyone knew the code in a duel. The winner had the right to finish it. For a long moment Kit didn't move. His face was hard, unreadable. Then he lowered the pistol and stepped back. "Get out of this valley," Kit said quietly, "and don't come back." Two of Jacques' friends helped him up. The Frenchman stumbled away, broken and humiliated, cradling his destroyed hand. Kit never saw him again. Legend had it Jacques died of infection weeks later, or maybe he just slunk back to Canada in shame. Kit turned to find Aiyana walking toward him. She carried a clay pot filled with bear grease mixed with healing herbs. Without a word, she gestured for him to sit. Kit sat. Aiyana knelt beside him and gently applied the salve to his burned scalp. Her touch was impossibly soft, and her face was very close to his. She smelled like sage, smoke, and tanned leather. "You are either very brave," she said, in perfect English, "or very foolish." Kit managed a slight smile. "Probably both." "Why did you do that?" He thought about it. "Because it was right." Aiyana's eyes searched his face. Then she smiled, a real smile that transformed her from beautiful to luminous. "What is your name?" "Christopher Carson." "Most folks call me Kit." "Kit," she repeated, trying it out. "I am Aiyana. And I think, Kit Carson, you are going to change my life." The courtship, such as it was, took 3 days. Kit learned that Aiyana wasn't just beautiful and skilled, she was sharp as a blade. She spoke 4 languages, Arapaho, Lakota, English, and some French. She could read the weather from the clouds, predict where game would be, and treat wounds with combinations of roots and herbs that seemed like magic. More importantly, she saw through Kit's quiet exterior to the lonely, decent man underneath. On the 3rd evening after the duel, Kit approached Chief Broken Lance's lodge. He'd spent his remaining cash and trade goods, assembling a proper bride price: 3 good horses, 2 fine blankets, his second-best rifle ammunition, and a silver mirror he'd been saving for years. It was everything he owned except his primary gun and the clothes on his back. Chief Broken Lance was a weathered man in his 50s, with gray streaking through his long hair. He examined Kit's offerings carefully, then looked at the young man. "You defeated the loud one," Broken Lance said in English. "But do you have the patience to be my daughter's husband? She is strong-willed." "Difficult." There was pride in his voice. "Sir," Kit said carefully, "I don't want to tame her. I want to learn from her." Broken Lance's eyes crinkled. He nodded and accepted the bride price. The wedding was a wild affair, even by rendezvous standards. It lasted 3 days and nights. There was horse racing, wrestling, storytelling, and more food than Kit had seen in years. Buffalo hump roasted over open fires, fresh trout from the river, and whiskey, so much whiskey that half the camp was drunk for 48 hours straight. But the heart of it was simple. Aiyana moved her belongings from her father's lodge to Kit's camp. She built a fire in front of his tent. She cooked him a meal. By Arapaho custom, these actions declared them married. That first night, as a husband and wife, they sat together by their fire while the celebration raged around them. Aiyana wore her finest dress, decorated with thousands of trade beads that caught the firelight like stars. "Are you afraid?" she asked him. "Of what? Of how much your life just changed?" Kit thought about it. "No," he said finally. "I think my life just started." She laughed a sound like running water. Then she kissed him, and the rendezvous with all its noise faded into the background. If you had asked Christopher Kit Carson in his early 20s what made a good wife, he probably would have mumbled something practical about cooking stew or mending a torn shirt. He was a man of the mountains, after all, where romance was a luxury and survival was a daily grind. He had no concept of what a true partnership could be until Aiyana sat by his fire. She did not just share his life, she elevated it. She took the rough, solitary existence of a trapper and refined it into something that resembled art. The transformation began with the economy of their small camp. For years, Kit had processed his own beaver pelts. He would scrape them clean, stretch them on willow frames, and let them dry in the sun. The result was functional, stiff, thick parchment that cracked in the cold and soaked up water like a sponge. They sold for 50 cents a pound, enough to buy powder and lead but little else. Aiyana's approach was different. To her, a hide was a canvas. Her process was an exhausting alchemy known as brain tanning, a secret passed down through generations of Arapaho women. It was brutal, backbreaking work. She would spend days scraping the hide with a sharpened bone tool, removing every trace of flesh and fat until the skin was pristine. Then came the mixture: animal brains cooked into a paste, which she rubbed deep into the fibers of the skin. This broke down the collagen, softening the leather from the inside out. Finally, she would smoke the hides over a low, smoldering fire of rotten wood for days. The smoke did two things. It turned the leather a rich, golden amber hue, and it chemically altered the fibers so they would never stiffen even after being soaked in a river. One evening, after a long day of checking traps, Kit sat by the fire watching her. The wind was howling outside, but inside their lodge, it was warm. He reached out and gently took Aiyana's hands. They were raw, the knuckles red and swollen from the freezing water and the endless scraping. He didn't say a word. He simply opened a tin of bear grease and began to massage it into her cracked skin. It was a moment of quiet intimacy, an acknowledgement of the physical toll she paid for their prosperity. Aiyana didn't pull away. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing. In that silence, Kit realized that every golden pelt she produced was a physical manifestation of her commitment to their survival. The payoff came at the next rendezvous. Kit approached the trading post of Silas Meeks, a notorious pinchpenny from St. Louis, who prided himself on fleecing mountain men. Meeks looked at the stack of furs on the counter and sneered. "Beavers down this year." Carson Meeks grunted, not even looking up. Markets flooded. 50 cents a pound. Take it or leave it. Kit didn't argue. He simply untied the leather thong binding the bundle and rolled out the top pelt. It spilled across the counter like liquid gold, velvety, soft, smelling faintly of wood smoke and sage. Meeks stopped. He reached out, his greedy fingers sinking into the fur. He rubbed the leather between his thumb and forefinger. It was as pliable as cotton cloth. "Water," Kit said softly. He took a tin cup of water and poured it directly onto the expensive fur. The trader gasped. On a normal pelt, the water would soak in, ruining the cure. On Aiyana's pelt, the water beat it up like mercury and rolled off, leaving the fur underneath perfectly dry. The trading post went silent. Other trappers gathered around, staring. $2, Kit said. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. $2 a pound, or I walk across the valley and sell to the Hudson's Bay Company. Meeks ground his teeth. He knew he could sell these golden fleeces to the hatters in New York for 10 times that price. Done, he spat. That year, Kit and Aiyana rode away with the finest rifles, imported wool blankets, and enough credit to last 2 winters. They were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. But the mountains were treacherous, and money could not stop an arrow. The true revolution of their marriage wasn't economic, it was intellectual. Aiyana knew that for Kit to become a legend, he had to stop thinking like a white man and start thinking like a native of the plains. The education was grueling. "Your hands are too stiff," she would scold him gently by the firelight, slapping his fingers. "You move them like you are holding a rifle. You must move them like water." She was teaching him the plain sign language, the universal silent tongue used by dozens of tribes from the Comanches in the south to the Blackfeet in the north. "Cup your hands," so she demonstrated her movements graceful and fluid. "This is water. Now, spiral the finger up. This is smoke. Cross the arms. Trade." It was humbling for Kit. He was the best shot in the territory, a man who could track a deer over stone, yet here he was fumbling like a schoolboy. But Aiyana was relentless. She taught him not just the signs, but the etiquette. How to enter a teepee always to the right, how to accept a pipe, pass it to the left, how to read the tension in a chief's shoulders. She was molding him. She was taking the raw iron of his courage and forging it into the steel of diplomacy. The final exam came on a crisp autumn morning in the Bighorn Basin. Kit and Aiyana were riding through a narrow canyon when the wind shifted. Horses. The smell of sweat and paint. Suddenly the ridge above them bristled with silhouettes. A war party of 20 Lakota Sioux appeared, their faces painted for battle bows drawn. Kit's instinct, honed by 10 years of kill or be killed warfare, screamed at him to draw his pistols. His hand twitched toward his belt. Grip. Aiyana's hand clamped over his forearm. Her grip was iron hard. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on the ridge. She whispered a single word in Arapaho: "Wait." Kit froze. The silence in the canyon was deafening. A single gunshot would mean their instant massacre. Slowly, deliberately, Aiyana nudged her horse forward. She didn't raise a weapon. She raised her open hand. Then she began to sign. "Friend. Peace." Hungry, the Lakota leader on the ridge, lowered his bow slightly. He signaled back. "Who are you, Kit?" Took a breath. He remembered the nights by the fire. He remembered Aiyana's fingers guiding his. He holstered his fear. He rode up beside his wife, puffed out his chest, and began to sign. His movements were no longer stiff. They were fluid, confident. "I am Carson, husband of Aiyana. We have tobacco. We trade." The tension broke like a fever. The Lakota leader nodded and signaled for his warriors to lower their weapons. What could have been a bloodbath turned into a roadside trade. They shared tobacco. They exchanged news of the buffalo herds. As they rode away an hour later, alive and unharmed, Kit looked at the woman riding beside him. The sun was setting, casting a halo around her dark hair. He realized then that she hadn't just saved his life, she had given him a new one. He was no longer just a scout. He was a bridge between two colliding worlds. And soon that bridge would have to carry a new passenger. Aiyana placed a hand on her stomach and smiled at him, a secret dancing in her eyes. "We will need more soft skins," she said quietly. "For the little one." Adeline was coming. Kit Carson was a man who could sleep soundly while hunted by Blackfoot warriors. He could cross a freezing river in full flood without a shiver. But as the first snows of October 1837 dusted the peaks of the Wind River Range, Kit found himself paralyzed by a terror he had never known. Outside the small, secluded birthing lodge constructed by the Arapaho women, the legendary scout was reduced to a pacing, trembling wreck. He sat on a log attempting to whittle a small piece of pine into a toy horse. His hands that could reload a rifle in 30 seconds under fire were shaking. The knife slipped. A drop of bright red blood hissed onto the pristine white snow. He stared at it, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the wilderness, blood usually meant death. He prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in years that today it meant life. When Aiyana's mother finally emerged and nodded Kit didn't walk, he stumbled into the lodge. The air inside was thick with the scent of burning sage and the metallic tang of birth. Aiyana lay on a pile of buffalo robes, exhausted sweat matting her dark hair. But her eyes were triumphant. In her arms lay a bundle no larger than a loaf of bread. "Come," Aiyana whispered. Kit approached as if the bundle were made of glass. He looked down. A pair of dark, unfocused eyes stared back from a wrinkled red face. "She is Adeline," Aiyana said, using the name Kit had chosen. Then she leaned down and whispered into the baby's ear, in Arapaho, "But the spirits will know her as Prairie Flower." Kit reached out. His hands were stained with gun oil, scarred by knife slips, and calloused from years of gripping reins and ropes. As he took his daughter, he felt a crushing weight settle onto his shoulders. It wasn't the weight of the child, it was the terrifying weight of love. For the first time in his life, Kit Carson realized he was vulnerable. A man with nothing has nothing to lose. A man with a family is a hostage to fortune. The next 3 years were a golden age, a fleeting summer in the long winter of Kit's life. They moved with the seasons, a self-contained universe of 3. Kit did not raise Adeline on nursery rhymes or fairy tales. He raised her on the curriculum of survival. By the time she was 2, she rode in a cradleboard on Aiyana's back, a masterpiece of beadwork that Aiyana had stitched with blue beads to represent the sky, a prayer for protection. By 3, Adeline was sitting on Kit's lap by the fire, her small fingers tracing the scars on his hands. "Listen," Kit would whisper, holding up a hand to silence the wind. "What bird is that, Jay?" Adeline would chirp. "No. Listen again. The rhythm is wrong. That is a crow scout signaling his party." He taught her that the wilderness was not a playground. It was a living thing that demanded respect. He watched Aiyana teach her to gather roots and cure leather while he taught her to read the clouds and the tracks in the mud. They were happy. It was a fierce, bright happiness that burned hot against the cold reality of the frontier. But often late at night, while Aiyana and Adeline slept entangled in the furs, Kit would sit awake, his rifle across his knees, staring into the dark. He watched the rise and fall of his daughter's tiny chest, and a cold dread would coil in his stomach. He knew the mountains. He knew that the brighter the sun, the darker the shadow it casts. And he knew with the instinct of a man who had survived too much that a storm was coming that no amount of gunpowder could stop. The winter Adeline turned 5 was brutal. The snow came early and deep, trapping them in a valley for weeks. But they were prepared. They had plenty of food, warm furs, and each other. And Aiyana was pregnant again. Another daughter, Aiyana predicted one night, her hand on her swollen belly. "I can feel it." Kit hoped she was right. He'd become quite fond of having daughters. But this pregnancy was different. Aiyana was tired all the time. Her usually boundless energy seemed to drain away. Still, she insisted she was fine, that this was normal. When her time came, they were alone, just the 3 of them, in their winter camp. It was too dangerous to travel through the deep snow to find her people. Kit's job was simple: keep Adeline calm and warm in the main tent, while the older woman from a nearby Shoshone camp helped Aiyana in the birthing lodge. The labor took all night and into the next day. Through the tent walls, Kit could hear Aiyana's pain, and it nearly drove him mad with helplessness. Finally, silence. Then a baby's cry, weak but present. Kit waited and waited. The cry stopped. Still no one came to get him. Finally, the Shoshone woman emerged. Her face told Kit everything. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "The baby. She came too early. She couldn't breathe." And Aiyana, the woman's face crumpled. "Fever. It's spreading fast. I've tried everything." Kit burst into the lodge. Aiyana lay on furs, her face flushed and sweating despite the cold. Beside her, wrapped in soft deerskin, was the tiniest baby Kit had ever seen. She wasn't moving. "Kit," Aiyana whispered. Her voice was barely audible. I'm sorry. I tried. Don't, Kit said, kneeling beside her. Don't apologize. You're going to be fine. You're the strongest person I know. But she wasn't fine. The puerperal fever, that ancient killer of new mothers, had taken hold. Without modern medicine, without antibiotics, there was nothing anyone could do. Aiyana died as the sun rose on the third day. Kit held her hand until the very end, even as she lost consciousness, even as her breathing became shallow and finally stopped. He sat there for hours afterward, unable to move, unable to accept what had happened. It was Adeline's small voice that finally brought him back. "Papa, where's Mama?" Kit Carson burned the birthing lodge. It was Arapaho custom. The place where someone died should not remain. But it was also practical. He couldn't bear to look at it. He buried Aiyana and the baby on a hillside overlooking the valley, wrapped in the finest furs he owned. He marked a grave with stones in the Arapaho way and sat vigil for 3 days, barely eating, barely sleeping. When he finally returned to their tent, Adeline ran to him. "Is Mama coming back?" Kit knelt and pulled his daughter close. "No, sweetheart. Mama's gone to be with the spirits. She's watching over us from the sky now." Adeline cried for hours. Kit cried with her. And when the tears finally stopped, they had to face a new, terrible reality. They were alone. Kit tried. God knows he tried. He continued trapping, but now with a 5-year-old in tow. He'd leave Adeline with other women in the camps they visited, but she'd cry for hours until he returned. She was grieving, terrified of losing him too. He hired wet nurses when he could find them, paid women to watch her, and tried to keep their life going. But winter in the Rockies is unforgiving, and Kit was increasingly haunted by nightmare scenarios. What if he was killed by a bear? What if he got caught in an ambush? What would happen to Adeline? One night, watching his daughter sleep, Kit faced the hardest truth of his life. This world, the world he loved, the wild frontier he'd made his home, was no place for a child alone. Adeline needed stability. She needed education. She needed a future that wasn't defined by starvation and violence. She needed things Kit couldn't give her in the mountains. The decision nearly killed him, but he made it anyway. In the spring, Kit packed their belongings and began the long journey east to St. Louis. It took months of hard riding, river crossings, and camping under stars that reminded him painfully of Aiyana. When they finally reached St. Louis's bustling streets, Adeline clutched his hand, terrified by the crowds and buildings and noise. Kit felt like a ghost haunting his own past, disconnected from this civilized world he'd left behind years ago. He found a convent school, the Sisters of Loretto, who educated daughters of traders and mountain men. The nuns were kind, the school was clean and safe, and the cost was reasonable. Kit arranged to pay them quarterly from his trapping earnings. On Adeline's first day, Kit walked her to the door. She was wearing her first real dress, not buckskin but cotton with lace. She looked tiny and lost. "I don't want to stay here," she whispered. "I know, sweetheart." Kit's throat was tight. "But you'll learn to read and write. You'll make friends. You'll have a good life. Will you visit every chance I get?" Kit promised. It was a lie. He knew the mountains would pull him back, that months or years might pass between visits. But he couldn't bear to tell her that. Adeline hugged him fiercely. Then, showing the bravery she'd inherited from both her parents, she let go and walked inside. Kit stood on that street corner for a long time after she disappeared. He'd faced death 100 times without flinching, but watching his daughter walk away from him into that school was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Kit needed money, desperately. The school fees, clothes, food, it all cost more than he'd anticipated. He needed work, and he needed it fast. He found it on a St. Louis riverboat. Robert Campbell, a fur company owner, was organizing an expedition into unmapped territories. He needed guides, but not just any guides. He needed the best scouts in the West. Someone mentioned Kit Carson's name. When Robert found him, Kit was on the boat's deck, staring at the muddy Missouri River, lost in thought. His buckskins were worn, his face weathered beyond his 40 years. He looked like exactly what he was, a man between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Mr. Carson, Robert extended his hand. I hear you know the Rocky Mountains better than any man alive. Kit shook his hand. I know them well enough. I need a scout. Someone who can keep an expedition alive in hostile territory. Someone who speaks the languages, knows the trails. Robert paused. I've heard stories about you. They say you're the best. Kit looked at this young, eager officer and saw himself from years ago, full of dreams and confidence, not yet broken by loss. The stories exaggerate, Kit said quietly. Even so. Will you come? Kit thought of Adeline in her new school. He thought of Aiyana buried on a hillside, 1,000 miles away. He thought of the promise he'd made to himself to give his daughter a future no matter what it cost him. Yes, Kit said. I'll come. Robert smiled. Excellent. When can we leave? Kit looked west toward the mountains that held everything he'd loved and lost. Whenever you're ready. As the riverboat's paddle wheel churned the water, Kit pulled out a small leather pouch he wore around his neck. Inside was a single bead, turquoise blue part, of the beadwork Aiyana had sewn into his favorite jacket. He held it up to the sunlight, and for a moment he could almost see her standing on that hillside, the wind in her hair smiling at him. You did the right thing, he imagined her saying. Now go. There's still work to do. Kit tucked the bead away and turned toward the west. The expedition would make him famous. History would remember him as one of the greatest scouts and frontiersmen America ever produced. His name would appear in dime novels and history books. He would guide armies, explore new territories, and become a legend. But none of that mattered to Kit Carson. What mattered was a little girl in a convent school learning to read and write. What mattered was keeping a promise to a woman who'd taught him that love wasn't about possession. It was about partnership, respect, and sacrifice. And what mattered was honoring Aiyana's memory by living a life worthy of having loved her. The scout's vow isn't about glory or adventure. It's about a quiet man who discovered that true courage isn't facing death without fear. It's choosing to live with loss, to carry on, when your heart is broken, to do what's right, even when it tears you apart. Kit Carson rode into the sunset that day, heading back toward mountains that would never feel quite like home again. But he rode anyway, because that's what you do when you make a promise. THEEND author's note. This story is based on the real life of Christopher Kit Carson, 1809-1868, and his Arapaho wife Aiyana, singing grass, though I've taken creative liberties with details and dialogue. Their daughter, Adeline Carson, was indeed sent to school in St. Louis, and Kit's meeting with Robert Campbell led to his famous career as a scout and guide. The love story at the heart of this tale, however, is historically documented, a genuine partnership between two remarkable people in an extraordinary time.